Africa was on an upward trajectory. We were entering that exponential curve where the number of cases was increasing rapidly. And then on the 26th of March, it took a turn. On the 26th of March, instead of continuing a straight upward exponential curve, the epidemic took a turn. And what we began to see, a decline in the number of cases, and then we reached a stage of what we call a plateau, where we were just seeing a similar number of cases every day. Now, the 26th of March is significant because that was the date of the lockdown. And if we look at the number of new cases, next slide, it becomes a little bit clearer. So this is the moving average of the number of new cases in the dark line. The light line tells you the actual number of reported new cases each day. So when you look at this curve, what you can see is that we were on a simple trajectory like every other country, increasing rapidly, day by day. And then suddenly on the 26th of March, it turned and started going down again. And as it went down, it reached a point somewhere around 60, 70 cases a day, and it sort of hovered around there. Now, each day's numbers offer a lot of variability, and a lot of it is just background variability and noise. So it's better to look at it in terms of a moving average and to look at it in blocks of time, so you get rid of some of the background noise and look at the average numbers. Next slide. So why is South Africa not on the expected COVID epidemic trajectory? Next slide. I've chosen to compare South Africa with the UK just because for the first 2 weeks or so, the number of new cases we had in South Africa was virtually the same as the number of cases that we saw in the UK. In other words, in the initial period, the new cases in each of our countries at that point, after we reached 100 cases, was very similar. Suddenly, on the 26th of March, our line chooses not to continue the same upward trajectory that you see in the UK. That's not to say that our two countries are comparable, but certainly the initial trajectory of these two epidemics was similar. So what happened on the 26th of March was that we saw that as the numbers declined and became stable, the line sort of flattens out. And that's the difference between the two trajectories that you see. Next slide. Is that unique to the UK? Well, let's compare the South African line. And you can see again in the black, there's this little line that looks like a sort of a knuckle, where it goes up sharply and then takes a turn, and then it flattens out. If you look at that line and you compare it to a range of different countries, and I've chosen here to compare it against the US, the UK, Italy, China, it gives you some sense that every one of these countries, when they get into that upward incline where we see that exponential line, it simply keeps going. Not a single country that we have seen has this kind of turn. I've also compared our epidemic curve to some of the most successful countries, countries that have been able to make quite a marked impact on the growth of the epidemic. And those in particular, South Korea and Japan and Singapore. So when you compare our epidemic, you can see that Singapore was able to make an early impact and to create a much more steady growth in their epidemic. Whereas if you look at South Africa, there's been no other country. So our epidemic trajectory is unique. No other country has reached that point and has been able to reach a stage where you get that kind of plateau. So why is South Africa different? Why is it that our new cases declined and have reached a plateau? Well, there's three possible reasons. The first, is it that we're just testing less? Is it that we're just not doing enough tests, and that's why we're just seeing fewer cases? Is it that we actually are still doing a lot of tests, but we're doing them mainly in the private sector and not in the public sector? And so we're not getting a sense of what the epidemic is doing in our poorer communities that don't have medical aid. Or the third possible explanation is this reduction genuine? And what's the likelihood that it's genuine and that it's due to the interventions that we have implemented? Next slide. So in this slide, I'm showing you on the left-hand side, this is a graph of the number of tests that are being done in the public and private sectors combined. What do you see in that? You see that over the 2 weeks in which we saw the South African epidemic go into a sort of plateau phase, what we see is a continual increase in the number of tests that are being undertaken. So it's certainly that we didn't do much fewer tests. In fact, the overall numbers of tests have steadily increased in the last 2 weeks. So that eliminates that, or it reduces the likelihood that it's just simply a problem of lack of testing. Lack of testing may be a contributor, but it's certainly not a dominant one. So are we not testing the poorer communities? Well, if we look on the right-hand side, that's the daily number of tests that are being done by the NHLS. The NHLS is the public part of the laboratory service. And so all of our poorer communities without medical aid will be coming to the NHLS for their testing. And what do you see? Just at the time that you saw the plateau in the South African trajectory is the point at which the NHLS sharply increased the number of tests that it's doing. And we've seen that steady increase in the number of tests in the NHLS. So it's not because we're not testing in the townships and the communities. It simply has to be a third explanation. So it's unlikely due to a lack of testing, or a decline in testing. It's unlikely to be due to the fact that we're not testing in the communities, the poorer communities. So it's most likely to be due to some genuine effect. So let's look at that. And it's not something we can say definitively, but we can say that that's the likely situation. So our COVID-19 cases have declined over the 2 weeks, while the NHLS test numbers have increased, and while testing in people in communities without medical aid has increased.